Sonnenschein, Executive Vice President here at the Institute, and it is a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to today's program. Today we're going to hear about an important new report from the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, and it is called Mobilizing the Will to Intervene, Leadership and Action to Prevent Mass Atrocities. And I know we will have an interesting discussion in just a moment. We at the Institute are very, very grateful today to be hosting Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire. Thank you for all you have done to inspire us through your courage and commitment to saving innocent lives in Rwanda and beyond. I don't need to tell this audience that genocide is the antithesis of peace. And over our 25-year history at the U.S. Institute of Peace, we have been deeply engaged in efforts to understand and prevent mass violence and to help societies recover from the horrors of mass violence. Last December, I had the privilege to serve with some of my colleagues on a task force that was co-chaired by Madeleine Albright and Bill Cohen, along with the U.S. Holocaust Museum and the American Academy of Diplomacy. And we released Preventing Genocide, a blueprint for U.S. policymakers. We tried to identify a set of practical recommendations to improve the ability of the U.S. government to prevent genocide and mass atrocities. And I know that Secretaries Albright and Cohen have asked to send their regards to this event and to thank you all for your involvement in the issue. So we're pleased to be hosting this with our Canadian colleagues. Our moderator today, we are very fortunate to have James Traub here, who is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. He is the author of several books, including an excellent one on Kofi Annan and the United Nations. He was formerly the policy director at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. So I will ask Jim to introduce the other panelists and to again welcome all of you to today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tara. If you don't mind, I'll just speak from here. I think that's easiest. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our four panelists today. Sitting to my left, of course, is General Roméo Dallaire, who did not include on his bio, but who most importantly, as Tara alluded to, almost certainly did more than any other single individual to save Rwandans from the genocide in 1994 as commander of the UN mission there. You will also know him as Nick Nolte, from, to whom you will see he bears a striking resemblance from Hotel Rwanda. General Dallaire is now the senior fellow at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and co-director of this Will to Intervene project. Sitting to his left is Michael Gerson, who also did not include in his bio the signal fact that he was the assistant for policy and strategic planning for President Bush 43, and in that role played a very significant role on issues both of democracy promotion and also of engagement in the face of atrocities. And you'll see some of this outlined in Michael's very good book on his experience there, Heroic Conservatism. Michael is now Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on human rights, global health, and conflict resolution. And he is also a columnist for the Washington Post, and he contributes to Newsweek. To Michael's left is John Prendergast, who has, as I'm sure many of you know here, has had a deep, deep involvement in conflict issues in Africa, and especially in Darfur. John is co-founder of the Enough Project, which is an initiative to end genocide and crimes against humanity. During the Clinton administration, He was Director of African Affairs at the NSC and was deeply involved in African conflict situations then. He then served as, with the International Crisis Group, where I first knew John, as, was your title Head of Africa? Was that?
I think they demoted me for about a week of non-management.
I see. Well, he had an important title there, and really titles don't matter.
Yeah, they don't matter at all.
The fact is, John has been a tremendously important voice on Darfur and in other conflict situations there. So Andrew Natsios is, I don't know, is he late or not coming? But in any case, he's not here at the moment. So let me now turn this over to Dr. Frank Chalk, who will describe the report that we're all here to talk about today.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have the privilege of being the director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and General Dallaire's partner in the Will to Intervene project. I want to thank Tara Sonnenschein for her generous welcome this afternoon and tell you it has been a genuine pleasure to work with Lawrence Wucher and his colleagues at USIP. USIP, you bring to your work the consummate professionalism that we see in every publication and every conference that you sponsor. I also want to welcome two members of the Will to Intervene team, Carla Barquero on my left and Kyle Matthews sitting next to him, and a member of our research steering committee, Harvey Yarovsky, and his advocate colleague and old acquaintance of ours as well, Natalie. Our donors made the Will to Intervene project possible, thanks to the Simons Foundation of Vancouver, James Stanford of Calgary, the family of Aaron Fish, and the Irwin and Sarah Taubin Family Foundation for their generosity and for their commitment. Thanks, too, to my university, Concordia in Montreal, which came through with crucial seed funding and has always supported our research, teaching, and publication aimed at preventing future genocides. Today, the International Day of Peace, we launch our case studies of American policies towards Rwanda in '94 and Kosovo in 1999, and our recommendations on mobilizing the will to intervene to the government of the United States, civil society, and the media. Our report was born in hope, the hope we at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies share with General Roméo Dallaire, that concrete, factual analyses and practical recommendations can change the way our democratically elected political leaders think and act. We ask President Obama and the Congress for nothing less than a paradigm shift, a change in how our leaders view the world. Specifically, we seek to persuade the leaders of the United States to adopt a concept of the national interest that incorporates the notion that preventing genocide and other mass atrocities serves the vital interests of the American people, and not doing so puts the welfare of American citizens at risk. The age of the global village has truly dawned. Ignoring instability and conflict leading to genocide and other mass atrocities seriously threatens the security, health, and prosperity of the American people. Terrorism and piracy, epidemics of lethal infectious diseases, and denial of access to vital raw materials multiply rapidly in the global village when we exclude failed and failing states from our radar screens. Our project interviewed over 80 senior American and Canadian foreign policy practitioners and opinion shapers in the United States. The result of these interviews are the lessons learned and the practical, concrete recommendations in our report. Let me just summarize a few of what the lessons learned that came out of our case studies. Before the genocide began, excessive focus on the political peace process and the Arusha Accords and inadequate attention to reports from the ground fueled America's failure to anticipate the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Rwandans in 1994. As Prudence Bushnell, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Africa, told us, there was a profound lesson for me as a policymaker in that you can be so focused on your policy that you have blinders on. Second, a knee-jerk political reaction in Congress and the White House to the 1993 killing of the American Rangers in Somalia was elevated to high policy in Presidential Decision Directive 25. That policy guideline restricted future U.S. humanitarian intervention to Chapter 6 missions advancing U.S. interests. It was the relentless application of this directive that preempted an effective and meaningful U.S. response to the unfolding genocide in Rwanda. Third, critical intelligence information was confined to information silos and stovepipes in government agencies where it lay buried and silent, unable to stimulate meaningful preventive action by the United States. Ignored, disdained, or simply trashed General Dallaire's January 1994 cable from Kigali, Roger Winter's detailed reports and photos alerting all major United States intelligence agencies to the widespread slaughter of Tutsi civilians, and Rick Orth's warnings to his superiors inside the Defense Intelligence Agency that DIA had it wrong in its May 9th government intelligence briefing, and the killing in Rwanda was already a genocide, not just a civil war or a politicide aimed at Tutsi politicians. These are examples, and only a few examples, of the deep sixing of the early warning and ongoing warning while the genocide unfolded. 4, an active will not to become involved in Rwanda emanated from the advisors around President Clinton, and especially from his special assistant, Richard Clarke, who in many other respects is admirable. It was his special assistant who chaired the Peacekeeping Corps Group, which met on April 13, 1994, and decided to pursue a full withdrawal of the United Nations military force from Rwanda. It did this despite Belgium's appeal on April 8th that UN troop reinforcements should be raised and sent to Rwanda. Moreover, acting as if no consultation with the president was required because he already knew the president's wishes, Secretary of State Warren Christopher on April 15, 1994, called for the total withdrawal of all UN troops from Rwanda, informing the U.S. mission to the UN that, quote, "We will oppose any effort at this time to preserve a UNAMIR presence in Rwanda," end of quote. Only after the intervention of UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright and her confrontation with Richard Clarke did the White House agree that a token force of 270 UN troops, underarmed and practically immobile, could remain in Rwanda. In that confrontation, alleges Albright, Clarke told her to follow her orders, to which she replied, screaming into the telephone, "They are unacceptable. I want them changed," prompting Clarke to tell her to chill out and calm down. Fifth, fear of a domestic political backlash if American troops were deployed in Rwanda gripped the White House in April and May 1994. That April, Tony Lake, President Clinton's national security advisor, told Alison Day Forge of Human Rights Watch that she did not represent a sufficiently important political constituency to force the government to change its position. In his interview with W2I, or Project, Kenneth Roth characterized Lake's advice that HRW make more noise as, quote, "a cheap excuse," declaring, "It's basically saying, force us to do it because we're not going to take the political risks involved to do the right thing." At the same time, according to U.S. Ambassador to Rwanda David Rawson, President Clinton had invited him to meet with him at the White House following the successful evacuation of American nationals, I should say, from Rwanda. But he was kept from meeting with the president, who never heard in person his recommendation that the U.S. support the UNAMIR mission and the requests being put forward by General Dallaire. Sixth, the media failed in its role as a surrogate early warning system. Consequently, the American public remained ill-informed about the genocide and the diplomatic and military options available to halt it. The American media focused on the flow of refugees into the Democratic Republic of Congo, even while the story of some 8,000 Rwandans who were being slaughtered each day remained untold. Seventh, Due to time constraints, I must conclude this summary with just one observation from our case study on the 1999 intervention in Kosovo. No matter what one thinks about NATO's decision to act without Security Council approval till after the fact, American policymakers manifested a clear will to intervene to prevent mass atrocities, and their policies were effective. This is significant. It shows what can be done when early warning of looming mass atrocities mobilizes U.S. leaders to lead and to act. Milosevic went too far when he tolerated the slaughter of Bosnian Muslims at Srebrenica, and everyone learned that his word was meaningless. Thanks to Richard Holbrooke, David Sheffer, Madeleine Albright, and other American leaders, and to their willingness to identify clearly and disseminate widely that the threat of ethnic cleansing and genocide was serious and real, the intervention garnered domestic and international support. The intervention worked, and it demonstrated that the United States and its allies have the power to act when they summon the political will, be it through soft power or, if that fails, the use of military force. Now, I would like to turn the floor over to Mon Général, Roméo Dallaire, my wonderful partner in conceiving and directing the Will to Intervene project. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schock, and ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to be brief, and that's a near impossibility for a general who's an apprentice politician in Canada. But I did learn one lesson, and I have my legal counsel with me here who's worked with me on the International Tribunal. So, Maître Jarowski, welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to present this study and the work that we hope it will initiate within the United States and Canada in regards to the ultimately prevention of mass atrocities and genocide. For that's the aim of the exercise, is to prevent and not to simply try to stop or to curtail atrocities that are already well advanced and the impact that they will have on us. We are speaking about not the international community at large and its institutions as many have in regards to the solving of this problem or the will of nation states to intervene. I have often spoken enough about the fact that in Rwanda, although we quite readily were prepared to use the UN as the scapegoat and accuse the Secretariat of failing and of some failings, yes. However, the ultimate failure in Rwanda was the individual sovereign states that refused to provide assets to the UN to do anything concrete, and refusing from political will all the way down to the use of force. And in so doing, permitted even ultimately 6 weeks into the genocide that a genocide was recognized, a UN mandate was given to reinforce, to protect still about another 300,000 ultimately victims. None of the developed countries provided any assets until the end with the French, and we at times are quite questioning the motivation there. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a situation where I found that the deficiency in regards to operationalizing responsibility to protect was one not of managing crises, but in fact of outright leadership. Leadership nationally, and leadership nationally not only within the higher spheres of government, but also at the more state or province and municipal levels in regards to being cognizant of the impact that these mass atrocities and genocides will have on their population, in particular on their political future. For those conflicts will generate enormous impacts in our security, in our well-being, as the problems are exported. We are no more in an era where we can use the old tools of solving a problem in an isolated country and feeling that isolation by the distance in which we have between us. Those nations and what happens there, the pandemics that can be brought over, the terrorism and insecurity that could come from there, the increasing diasporas in our nations because we are immigrating nations, all move, in fact, with poverty and climate change, as that affects certain countries and moves them to friction, affects our ability to sustain our security and also our health and the continuum of our well-being in regards to resources. And so that's what we're going after. We're going after taking the study on genocide that was done and alluded to and pushing it to the next level. We're not seeking an international new forum to be created. We want internally into these nations the realization that prevention of genocide and mass atrocities is in the self-interest of the nation, which is one of the favorite tools used by politicians. First, it is the instrument of what's in it for me and why do I want to risk my political future in some problem which is complex. The second one is self-interest, but in the classic sense of, is there something tangible? And I remember the response from one nation in the first days of Rwanda where they came to look in, and they turned to me and said, "We're not coming in to help you, General, because there's nothing here. There's no strategic value here. The only thing that's here are human beings, and there's too many of them anyways." Self-interest now in an expanded way is what we're looking at. Self-interest of your security because of the asymmetric threats and also the communications and the ability of the world to move, and our own people who are more and more mobile and more susceptible to the problems. And the last element of decision-making of the politician is the fear of casualties. And the fear of casualties because we are, of course, more human than them. And holding force commanders, holding missions accountable not for achieving mission success and protecting civilians, which ultimately is the aim, to permit then to reconstruction and stabilization of the country, but holding people accountable for the number of casualties we have and deciding politically on that in regards to public opinion. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're here to operationalize R2P. And I approached MIGS because as a member of the UN Genocide Prevention Advisory Board to the Secretary General, I needed tools to be able to go and, in fact, see what's on the ground and ultimately participate in preventing genocide. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Juan Mendez is here, who was our Undersecretary in the first one, and thank you for being here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that we create a lively debate, and I hope that we move the yardsticks into a new generation of foreign policy that is based, on self-interest, but a whole different perspective of what the self-interest of a nation means internationally. Thank you.
So we now have about an hour or so to explore these questions among ourselves, and then we'll leave plenty of time for those of you in the audience to ask questions. So I want to begin by examining this premise that General Dallaire especially was speaking of, which is to say, if we can expand our sense of what constitutes the national interest, we will no longer have to only face the problem of atrocities with what appears largely to be a moral proposition. We have to turn this into a national interest and self-interest proposition. And I want to ask both Mike and John, who served in administrations where these decisions were being made, about just that question. So let me start with you, Mike. I mean, you were really involved with Darfur and trying to push aggressive action there. And so I wonder if this model that we've been talking about fits your experience, and if it is right that had there been a more powerful national interest or political interest sense of what otherwise may have seemed like just a moral question, then that might have produced different kinds of outcomes there or in some other similar setting.
Well, I think the report and this approach has isolated the most important foreign policy argument here, which we learned in very dramatic ways in the Bush administration, that the despair and hopelessness of distant, unnamed parts of the world can have a tremendous immediate impact in the modern age on American national security. That's certainly true of terrorism. It's true of human trafficking. It's true of crime syndicates. It's true of drug trafficking. It's true of refugee flows. It's true of global pandemics. It's true of a lot of different issues. And we, faced that, obviously with a failed or semi-failed state in Afghanistan that had been essentially occupied by a foreign entity because of its weakness, and it had a tremendous effect. And so I certainly buy the overall argument. The reality in a lot of these questions is that there's very little immediate political cost to inaction. What you have to do is try to put structures in place that will convince people that there's an eventual historical judgment involved. And it was my concern, as we were more, as it related to the process that related to these things, is that the most important element was trying to get it higher earlier in the decision-making process to essentially put policymakers in uncomfortable positions, so that they could feel, even though this was not going to, be a massive political issue in the context of the next congressional election, that's not a likely argument, but that they would feel that there would be an issue of kind of a historical judgment involved, a longer-term issue. And I also felt very strongly that in order for that to happen, the way the American system works, there's a relatively small group of decision makers who surround the president that have to have this on their radar screen. It doesn't come up naturally through the process. In at least my experience, and I don't want to be hypercritical, but the State Department, the structure of regional bureaus, are normally, in normal course of things, are oriented towards the management of relationships, not the raising of emergencies to the highest level. And the question becomes how you get, and my experience was that there were actually pretty good intelligence products that related to genocide awareness, but the processes by which they got funneled to the highest levels of government in a timely fashion were lacking significantly. So there was a significant internal challenge. The significant external challenge was, I think that it's very important in a certain community to make the national security case. But my experience is that in raising the pressure, the political pressure and visibility of these issues, a lot of that had to do with the moral and religious constituency, at least in the United States. A moral constituency of the kind of traditional human rights community and the people that they are more normally associated with, increasing a religious awareness among more conservative American evangelicals about issues of global humanitarian concern. They were, together they were a fairly powerful series of influences and were important to people inside the system. I would commend the emphasis in here on a executive order. I remember when the Bush administration did an executive order on human trafficking, the presidential order. And what it does, it empowers people isolated in their own bureaucracies, who under normal circumstances would be ignored by broad structures, to say, the president said this. So even the president's early mention of Burundi, for example, during his administration, gave those people, particularly in the Burundi situation, a lot of leverage in the system. So that kind of top-down leadership, I thought, was quite important.
John, do you think that if the kinds of structural failures which the report describes in the case of Rwanda had not occurred, and that, for example, one had the kind of reforms that the report describes at the time in 1993 and 1994, would that have made a significant difference, or was the political calculation that the president was making so unshakable that these issues that we would wish had been presented to him might not actually have really deflected him at the time?
First of all, the big caveat, I didn't work for the administration in '94.
Okay.
Came in '96, partly because I think they were looking for people who were very, very strong critics of what had preceded, and to their credit, wanted to see some new thinking. That said, I don't know how representative or illustrative Rwanda is because of the fast onset and fast ending of the crisis. Simply, my own experience, I'm sure Michael's as well, and deeply frustrating experience is the processes, even when they're working well, take a long time to move, and the genocide occurred in 100 days. And so I think that, you know, the Sudan, Burundi, Congo, all these other cases are the ones that will predominantly be the ones we'll face in the future, though we need to learn as much as we can from what happened. So I'd like to take a crack at this, or a bite at this apple too, about national interest and you know what I wonder if there's an assumption here that's it's operating that national interest is based solely on national security issues alone. I think national interest is much more malleable than that. I think political interests dictate national interest and political, and therefore policy and political action much more than a strict interpretation of what is in our national security interest. I think we're much more, our system is much more sensitive to, as Michael was saying, the demands of key constituencies. They may not be majorities in any way, shape, or form, but if they're significant organized interest groups, as he pointed out, the human rights and the sort of church, the evangelical nexus that was so important for action on southern Sudan at a time when the administration, you know, was trying to determine its priorities globally and helped zero in on what may have been the biggest success of the Bush administration's first term diplomatically. Colin Powell says it sometimes, that the peace agreement that they were able to forge lead in ending the 2 million life war, death war in southern Sudan, and then the nexus between the human rights groups and the and some of the other religious groups, particularly the Jewish constituencies and the Congressional Black Caucus, driving early interest on the part of the Bush administration on Darfur. So I would say this, that policy, in my experience in the Clinton administration's second term, is made on a case-by-case basis. It's made on a country-by-country basis. You can have all the ideological directives you want, but generally, if we're going to or not going to respond robustly to a particular to a particular issue is going to be determined on each of the merits of each of those cases. And therefore, back to the original point, I think that the humanitarian and moral imperatives and the constituencies that support those humanitarian and moral imperatives are what is going to drive the calculus of policymakers going forward, even if we can make a better case, as this book does, for national security or national security rationale for action. What we have, last point, 30 seconds, is the beginning of a movement of people focused on genocide and mass atrocities. We have the beginnings of a better understanding of those networks that Michael referenced, of how to mobilize people in the 21st century on the internet to make a difference to their elected officials. And they're doing that on the basis of humanitarian and moral imperatives. They won't do it ever on the basis of, gee, maybe a disease will come here and maybe the terrorists will get us. That isn't what's going to motivate people. I think that's really, really important. So whereas we've got to make these cases inside the Beltway about the national security importance, outside the Beltway, what matters is what always will matter, is that people care about human beings being slaughtered, people care about lives being lost, and they want our government to do something as long as we're not putting a lot of soldiers in harm's way, and we can make the case for a specific thing that
So
that
General
can actually
Dallaire,
be
let me
done.
ask you, because I must say I had the same reaction to the report that John did. That is, that this is the way you speak to policymakers. It's the way you speak to a political elite. But the only way to get people to agree to do possibly painful things in countries very far away, of which they know nothing, is actually precisely the moral appeal that John described, and not the somewhat hypothetical feeling national interest appeal.
Well, we're talking about a new realpolitik, and that's what we're trying to push, in as much as that realpolitik has new parameters to it, in which the national interest is very much in the potential of being a target, and also providing significant problems to your country, even though the actual event is happening in far-off lands. And so you are right. We are going after the leaders, the political leadership, and not the managers of the problem, not those who manage the processes. We, in the original thinking, is that how do you get these leaders to want to intervene, even if it costs them troops, even if it costs them potentially public opinion? Because there is no doubt that the moral background is there, and there are different groups, and the NGO community is more and more coalescing and becoming more powerful, and will influence policy more and public opinion. But even with all that, and we got all the tools out there to back that up, there is still that red line that the politician, the leadership, has got to go to lead, and that is what's going to trip them to say go in, whether it takes them 2 days like Rwanda, which they could have done, and there were troops all over the place because they did it to pull everybody else out, so there was enough there to solve the problem, or it takes 7 or 8 years in Darfur, where we've been, and we probably need another 3 years before we actually work something out more decently, and by the divider 2.5 million people are still starving, being killed, and so on. I don't think it's those arguments. I think it is the fact that how do you get at that realpolitik decision maker ultimately to say go? And it is, in ending or ebbing my point, it is asking them to shift gears in the realpolitik of not looking short term of what is happening over the next couple of years, but longer term. That problem festering there is going to come across your shore. It's going to come in a plane. It's going to come into access to Coltram. That's going to influence your communications capability. And so we are asking for them to think long term. Very difficult, for the political structures of our countries are pragmatic, short term. And we are trying to push them, a pragmatism, but a new one, expanded but longer term.
But General Dallaire, is there a difference between what you need to do in order to change policies, structures, and so forth, so that you have the kind of long-term preventive policies that you're talking about here, and
we are setting the stage for shifting the political parameters of decisions in the immediacy. That is to say, we don't think that people are going to comprehend and grasp this tomorrow morning. We think that, there are politicians and leaders that are going to have to think of this integrate this into what they perceive as their foreign policy, and expanded self-interest, to be part of the foreign policy thought process and decision process, so that they can, maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's another generation, hopefully not that long, they will be able to have those things as standing operating procedures in their minds as politicians and be able to take the rapid decisions, because they know that they'll be held accountable for it later on by exactly those same people, those same moral references who are going to go after them later and say, you could have done something. And by the by, it's fine to establish instruments to reduce impunity and to reduce, the International Criminal Court and all these tribunals and so on. The problem is that how many of these bad guys do we put in jail? How many of these genocides do we have until we actually change people's opinion? It's not after the problem. And I guess I'll end with the following. The ultimate aim here is to have the political courage to go in early, prevent it. That's the ultimate aim. That is the most cost-effective aim. And politically, although it seems risky, you might trip something and then you might be accused of doing it, or nothing happens and people say, why in the hell did you do all this? It seems to me that as we assess it, you will be held far more in recognition if you assess going in very early. And that doesn't mean with troops. That means by that soft power. And that's all the other tools of your foreign policy instrument.
Either one of you guys should feel free to jump in without my prompting if you have any response.
I would only add that, the argument is an interesting one, but it's similar. I do a lot of work in promoting development assistance. And it's a very similar type of argument. The pittance we spend on development assistance is not adequate to a long-term, strategic need. And you have to make that argument for long-term economic development, investment, and other things. But the way that you build a political movement around development assistance is to talk about AIDS, malaria, deeply moral concerns that really motivate the American public when it comes to these issues. So I think both of them are important. I think you really need a structure of thought that elevates the role of soft power, that says that it's not just an altruistic add-on to American national security policy. This is, in fact, the centerpiece commitment of American security policy, is to prevent rage, disorder, failed states, all these things that have long-term consequence. But I do think, John has a little bit of a different challenge, which is just how do you build the movement that's going to pressure politicians? And at least in the American political context, that's often based on kind of moral recognition of what's at stake. So.
John?
No, go ahead.
Well, I think that Mike touches on something else, which is that many of the kinds of the concerns you talk about in the report and and by the way, Frank, there may come a time when you should just intervene.
Yes.
So if there's a point where you feel like we've touched on something that you really you'd like, please feel free. Many of both the causes that are identified and the actions that are suggested would be the same if you stripped out the word mass atrocities and you put in the word weak and failed states. In some cases, even if you put in the word terrorism, that is to say, we need long-term development assistance in the way that Mike has described in order to accomplish X and Y and Z. And so it also raises the question, raises a couple questions. One is the amount of money that we seem to be willing to spend on these things is really limited. And so you can give it a new name and say, no, it's not because of failed states, it's because of the fear of atrocities. Okay, same pool of money, whatever word you want to put on it. Two, does it risk blurring the problem? Because now it turns out that mass atrocities are kind of a subset of something else, which is called weak and failing states, or failure of state building, or public health problems, and pretty soon it kind of turns into everything and therefore potentially nothing.
You can't start from scratch because the world keeps on going. I mean, you can't close the quartermaster stores to do an inventory and then we all start from afresh. And so you're absolutely right that we're living through a period in which the propensity of failing states and the pressures on these states from a whole series of asymmetric threats are making it just that much more a reality and are calling for us to respond. Some of them go catastrophic, as we are hopefully trying to avoid, and others simply fester on and someday may in fact go catastrophic, and will we actually realize that? Or they fester on and in fact attrit us, attrit our moral position, attrit our belief in human rights, because we're letting it go. I mean, look at Darfur. It is absolutely right. The American involvement, increased significantly in Darfur. But in what? In aid. I mean, that's fine. 84% of all the aid going into Darfur was from the United States. Meanwhile, there's another guy sitting in the Security Council who's pouring 71% of all the funding for the arming of the government, and the 2.5 million people are still sitting there waiting for something to resolve. And it's that what we're going at, that resolution from the political leadership willing to resolve things. And I guess in a real politics scenario that we're trying to articulate, I guess that we want people to anticipate and be able to sell the higher plane of anticipation as a responsible position in moving human rights and security and even self-interest versus a reactive one, where ultimately the first question is when do the Marines go in? When I went in front of Senator Durbin's committee, I mean, the first question I got was, well, how many do we go in, or how does the United States go in? And that may not, in fact, be the answer at all. Is what about the middle powers, like Canada and others? What are they doing sitting on? Why don't you send them in, and you guys hold the sort of political high ground and stay in Overwatch, and go in only if it goes totally catastrophic? And so there are other players who should be moving down the same methodology of self-interest, and not just the isolation of the superpower and feeling that they've got this role alone.